Very nice. I'd like to begin by thanking Northshire Bookstore for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to talk about my book, The Horse. The Horse is a story that exposes the dark side of human nature when a horse trainer's ownership stake in the champion racehorse Lizzie W. is stolen by a wealthy business partner at Saratoga's inaugural race meeting in 1863. This sets in motion a grisly train of revenge, murder, and madness. The horse is a Western. Thankfully, the Western is not dead. On the contrary, the Westerns stand at the threshold of what it means to be an American. Western stories fill our collective imagination and inform our sense of group reality. The catch, however, for contemporary Western writers is to find something new in an old form. The Horse accepts this challenge in several ways. First, the story reveals hidden realities through character development, drilling down to the bedrock psychology of the era and the era's characters. Bear in mind that The Horse is set in Civil War era Saratoga Springs in 1863, at a time when every sector of society is drawn to the thrill of thoroughbred horse racing, like moths to a open flame, while at the same time, the rest of the country is embroiled in an ongoing civil war. So the racial and class conflicts in the story are impossible to ignore. Some readers show interest in the psychology of the kill scene. The kill scene occupies approximately 10% of the story and harkens back to my days as a trial lawyer. So I'm fairly well qualified to discuss the psychology of the kills. The twists and turns of the courtroom scene are where the story finds its denouement. And oh, by the way, the African-American characters in the story are depicted as real people rather than as hideous and comical stereotypes. That's new. The style is direct, simple, and visual, but readers are cautioned against becoming intoxicated by the story's visual style, because the symbolism seeks to connect with universal themes throughout. So there you have The Horse in a nutshell. So many readers are frequently ask me and are interested in learning how the horse got to us in the first instance. While I won't bore you with the minutiae of my life story, however, I do feel compelled to highlight a few bullet points on the timeline. I was published as a teenager, graduated Colgate University. I spent 12 months as an exchange student at Skidmore College, which is here in Saratoga Springs, where I met the author, Joseph Bruchac, who took an interest in my writing. That was fortunate. From there, it was on to law school, where I became a lawyer. I spent time practicing as a trial lawyer for over 20 years. And it wasn't until I was no longer active in the practice of law that I dedicated myself to a career as a writer. Funny story. Out of this later period, I produced a 1,000-page, dark, psychologically complex, Dostoevsky-esque novel. And thankfully, prior to submitting it to a commercial publisher, I thought to submit it to my sister. A word about my sister: she's wonderfully erudite and has been a voracious reader from an early age. So my sister has this telephone book for about 3 weeks. Finally, the telephone rings. It's my sister. She says, "Well, I've finished reading the novel," followed by an audible sigh. I said, "Well, you finished reading the novel. What do you think?" Followed by a pregnant pause and still another audible sigh. And finally she said, "Oh, Jimmy, why don't you just write something people might like to read?" So that was an idea that hit me right between the eyes. So I said to her, "Pray tell, dear sister, what exactly is it that people might actually like to read?" She said, "Westerns. Everybody loves a Western. Western radio, Western television, Western books. Westerns, Westerns, Westerns." So the Western it was. My debut novel, A Good Day to Die, I submitted to exactly one publisher and got exactly one book deal. Good Day to Die is a story that features the exploits of a black male protagonist on the western frontier of the 1800s. And then, in the interest of editorial balance, I wrote my second novel titled Stagecoach Justice, which features the exploits of a black female protagonist on the western frontier of the 1800s. And The Horse is my third. So there are no questions at this point, I'm sure. So let's read The Horse. Let's start at the setup, at least part of the setup. The setup is at page 2. Like any gentleman of his stature, Mr. Tripps wanted to win at Saratoga more than anything in the world. When I confessed that I had no money to invest in the proposition, he said the gift of understanding the mysteries of racehorses I offered to the operation was considerably more valuable than any amount of money a man of my pedigree could ever hope to make in a dozen lifetimes. You have a gift, he confided, pulling the cigar out of his mouth to expand the point. Unlocking the mystery of horses to the point where their feet absolutely fly over a racetrack is a tall order, isn't it? I have no idea where a gift like that comes from. Do you? He drew smoke from the cigar, savored it, examined the cigar's lengths, and looked past me to the horizon. A man as powerful as Mr. Tripps never expects a response from a member of any of the subordinate classes. He had the credit and leverage to bid on any of the horses sent through the sales ring that he fancied, and I had the talent and patience to get them to the winner's circle. This was a perfect match, sort of like a pair of Etruscan cups stacked one on top of the other. According to the terms of our oral agreement, the instant the auctioneer's gavel fell and Mr. Tripps fronted the cash to complete the transaction, my 50% share of the horse vested, and the contract was binding even before the horse walked off the grounds. The plan was perfect in all respects, except I would later learn that no plan is perfect, particularly where, as here, it relies on a horse trainer for its authenticity. Now, skipping ahead, just a hint for the reader. The horse is a metaphor. The implied analogy between the horse bought and sold at auction and black Americans in the 1800s bought and sold on an auction block, that implied analogy is unmistakable. That will give you a little help with the symbolism as you read through the story. So we skip forward to the auction scene. A stylishly dressed groom wearing a black waistcoat, a fancy black derby, and white gloves, the kind of gloves used by butlers to wait tables or pallbearers to steady caskets, calmly posed the filly under the hot white lamps trained on the sales ring. The smell of the groom's hand against the horse's muzzle was obscured by the gloves, so not to disturb the horse's composure. The sales ring was enclosed by velvet ropes and polished brass standards. A cloud of blue cigar smoke hung over the audience. The allusion to Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man is unmistakable here. It's an allusion to Invisible Man. Every time I talk about illusion, I look at Miss Person like maybe she's the only one who might get this, and that's not the case. So let's read on. The excitement in the room matched the spectacle that attends prize fights or presidential debates. Yet Lizzie W. did not rear or show any signs of nervous energy whatsoever. Instead, there was a presence that was gorgeous and regal and arrogant in the way the chestnut filly was led into the ring. Her ears twitched. She stopped, stood at the center of the ring, and stared at the adoring audience and beyond as if she possessed an extra sense, a survival instinct the other beasts that passed through the ring that evening did not share. The groom pushed the filly's right shoulder while holding the shank, so the whole assemblage of horseflesh took a single backward step before continuing to stand professionally. The filly had been broken, prepped, and groomed for the occasion. Every hair on her body had been brushed to brilliance. Her tail had been combed and clipped. Her hooves were polished to perfection. Her conformation was absolutely stunning, even flawless. Okay, let's skip ahead I don't want to spoil too much of the story, but let's skip ahead to race day. And then a surprising character in the story is John Morrissey. John Morrissey is the gentleman who founded Saratoga Racecourse. And you might think John Morrissey was a blue blood, but actually he was quite the opposite. He was a bare knuckles boxing champion and a gambler and a very rough sort of guy. So let's go to race day. On race day, everybody said our opponent in the match race, the champion colt, Captain Moore, was unbeatable. He sure looked it. The bay colt was twice the size of our little filly, and the colt was on the muscle, pure specimen. Captain Moore's coat was brushed to brilliance, and his tail was braided, like it was groomed for the photographer in the winner's circle. The horse's past performances sustained that opinion, too. The colt was undefeated. It had won his last race by open lengths. Captain Moore had distinguished itself over the prestigious courses in Kentucky, Texas, and Louisiana against the finest horses in the nation, and he had done so with authority. Now, its connections were taking on the 4-day meet at the Saratoga Trotting Course. In those days, this is the 1800s, thoroughbred horse racing was predominantly confined to the South, places like Texas, Louisiana, and Kentucky. And the jockeys and trainers were predominantly black because racing horses at the time was considered servile or menial work. And the Trotter's Course stands opposite the modern day track on Union Avenue, close to the Oklahoma training track. And that starting gate that's used today, that iron contraption on wheels, didn't exist in the 1800s. Instead, there were 2 starters that drew a rope across the course, and a 3rd starter held a red flag aloft, dropped the flag, they dropped the rope, and then the race was on. And it was match racing. Races against 2 horses only, not full fields. So bear that in mind as we go forward. Let's talk about John Morrissey. He was the founder of Saratoga. John Morrissey was a career criminal, gambler, and heavyweight bare knuckles boxing champion who once beat a man named Yankee Sullivan senseless in a title bout that lasted 37 rounds before an outdoor audience in Boston of 3,000 bloodthirsty fans. The historical record notes that John Morrissey bit, pounded, and gouged Yankee Sullivan in each one of those 37 rounds. John Morrissey later boasted that he had used any means at his disposal to prevail, and the rules were only momentary inconveniences. Nothing stood in the way of the ferocity of his ambition. He accepted other prize fights in California, Ontario, and Troy, New York, to similar results. He conducted his business affairs at Saratoga in much the same manner that he treated his opponents in the boxing ring. His shoulders stood out the same way granite building blocks stand out alongside the majestic columns on the steps of the grand courthouses in New York and Philadelphia. I'm not sure how he earned the nickname Old Smoke, but it might have had something to do with his black, bushy beard, black peasant eyes, and slick black hair. Also might have harkened back to his impoverished Irish childhood and his lust to overcome his roots as an Irish immigrant in America by any means necessary, whether those means included working on the docks, hanging wallpaper, joining a gang, throwing his bare knuckles, or by setting apartments on fire as a tactic to compel delinquent tenants to surrender possession of their abodes without a legal challenge. In a peculiar way, criminality aside, he was uniquely American. Okay, in the interest of time, let's just go to one last excerpt. I think you have a fairly good sense of where the story's going. As I said, the match races were run in 3 heats. So the horse would have had to win 2 of 3 heats that day to prevail in the race. So I don't have time to go into all the heats, but at least I'll go into the first heat to give you a sense of how the race is laid out. In the first leg of the race was a sprint. There was no grandstand. However, Thralls of fashionably dressed men and women crowded the rail. Their faces were barely visible under gay umbrellas, black stovepipe hats, and straw voters with brightly colored hat bands. Both horses worked up a ladder during the warm-up gallop, so their coats grew slick and black in color. The starters drew a single rope across the course to ensure the horses got off to a level and fair start. The starter held up a red flag. The horses danced. The horses gathered together to face the rope. The starter yanked down the flag. The boys dropped the rope, and the race was on. The horses galloped as a pair, raiding over the first quarter of the race to the near turn of the oval. The excitement in the crowd was palpable. Both boys stood up in the irons like mirror images. The horses matched strides, picking up the pace along the backstretch. There still was no separation. The horses kicked their knees high and their necks were outstretched. There was no sign of fatigue in either horse. The boys began to urge the horses to pick up the pace around the far turn by pumping their legs and pushing the irons, but each boy was still standing up. As they turned for home, the horses quickened and dueled under heavy urging. Both boys bounced furiously in the saddle, pushed their mount's neck forward from behind the ears, and made liberal use of their sticks, furiously whipping and slashing horse flesh, asking for one final burst of speed to the finish line. That's when the crowd roared. There were random vulgarities and exhortations hurled from the masses, as well as if commentary could assert some sort of magical extrasensory influence over the outcome of the race. Captain Morry responded to his boy's slashing whip first and began to pull away. The filly tried to respond, but she was green and seemed to have problems coordinating her stride, untangling her legs, keeping her head straight on forward, and unleashing a closing kick of any consequence. The seasoned Captain Morry had no such problems. He beat the filly to the line. The colt had taken the first heat of the match race by slightly over 2 lengths. Bloody ridiculous, Mr. Trips screamed, massively enraged. Okay, so I think that's all we have time for the reading. And thank you very much. Very much. Thank you. I appreciate it.